I want to talk about self-worth because this is something that I see a lot of people struggling with, and this is something that I've struggled with as well in my own life. That feeling of inadequacy or deficiency, that feeling of not being enough. In fact, it still creeps up now and then. And somewhere along the way, it occurred to me that perhaps the way to approach all of this is to begin by dismantling all the false and limiting beliefs that we've gathered up throughout our lives, which suggest to us that we are unworthy, that we aren't of much value, or that we are deficient or defective. Maybe the problem isn't so much that we lack a sense of self-worth as much as we've adopted the belief that we are inherently unworthy. And so maybe we don't necessarily need to add anything. Maybe it's more about what we need to subtract, what we need to get rid of. Maybe the problem is that we rely too much on what other people think of us, how others evaluate us, whether or not other people accept and appreciate us. Maybe the problem is that we interpret people's behavior as an indication of our worth, so that if someone treats us poorly, disrespects us, or neglects us, we assume that this must be because there's something inherently wrong with us. It doesn't occur to us that maybe other people's behavior has little or nothing to do with us. It doesn't occur to us that maybe some people are simply incapable of loving anyone, including themselves. Maybe those who treat others poorly are deeply unhappy, and maybe it's out of their own sense of unworthiness that they behave the way they do. In other words, maybe their behavior has much more to do with their own unhappiness than it does with your worthiness. Maybe over time we've come to question our worth, or to see ourselves as having little or no worth because of these misinterpretations of other people's behavior. And in addition, all the diminishing opinions, the insults, the criticisms, the unkind words that others have said to us throughout our lives. Maybe we've taken all of that a bit too seriously, too personally, and even adopted some of those opinions as our own without really questioning them. And maybe what is needed is to spend some time looking at all of that, examining it, questioning it, because maybe the problem isn't that we don't have anything of value. Maybe the problem is that we're too caught up in these kinds of limiting beliefs that we just don't see it. Maybe the problem is that we value too much the evaluations of other people and not enough our own qualities and abilities. It might also be helpful in all of this to understand what it means for something to have worth or value, and to understand that value is ultimately subjective. It's not a fixed thing. And the value of anything is generally determined by its relative usefulness, or whether it elicits pleasure or relieves suffering, or by the needs or desires of each individual person. In other words, the value of anything is going to differ from one person to the next depending on a number of factors, depending on the situation. So if, for example, you're good at fixing cars, that's going to be really valuable to anyone with a broken car, but it's not going to have any value at all to someone who doesn't even own a car. And just because that person doesn't value that skill, it doesn't mean that it's any less valuable to those who might benefit from it. So whether or not other people see you as having anything of value to offer, well, that all depends on what other people value, on what they need or want, what they like and dislike. And everyone's needs are going to be different. Everyone's likes and dislikes are going to be different. Everyone has different tastes, different standards, different preferences, and so on. The other thing to understand is that even if something is valuable, some people will simply fail to see the value in it. And I'm sure that we've all done this, and maybe we still do at times. Maybe we sometimes fail to appreciate what we have. Sometimes we just take things for granted, and it often isn't until we lose something that we realize just how valuable it actually is. In the same way, what we have to offer others may be of value to them. It may benefit them in some way. It may be useful or helpful or even essential, and yet they may still fail to appreciate it, not because it doesn't have any value, but simply because of their own inability to appreciate it. Some people fail to appreciate because they're selfish or they have some sense of entitlement, or sometimes it may just be that they're so focused on what seems to be missing in their lives or overwhelmed with challenges or problems that they tend to overlook all the fortunate things they have. And again, maybe we can relate to that in some way, to being unable to appreciate what we have because all of our attention is on what we don't have, and so we fail to recognize how fortunate we actually are. So if someone doesn't appreciate you or what you have to offer, it could be because of their own failure to appreciate it for any of those reasons I just mentioned, or it could simply be that it really isn't of any value to them. Maybe they just don't need or want what you have to offer. Maybe it just doesn't interest them. And that doesn't mean that there isn't someone else who would appreciate it. It's just not that person. And I know that if we go through life continually encountering people who don't appreciate us or who devalue us, we can get the sense that maybe there's nothing about us to appreciate, that there's really nothing of value. But oftentimes the reality is that we also encounter many people who do appreciate us. But for some reason we tend to disregard that and to focus more on those who don't. And I wonder, why do we do this? Why do we seem to value the opinions of those who devalue us more than we value the opinions of those who appreciate us? It's as if we have this unrealistic need to please everyone. It's as if we need the approval of everyone, and it's either all or nothing. So if we don't have the approval and appreciation of every single human being that we encounter, then we take that to mean that there must be something inherently wrong with us. We're just not good enough. So even when someone does appreciate us, when someone compliments us or encourages us, when someone thanks us for something, when they tell us what they like about us, when they tell us that they love us, or in any way show us that they value us, we might have the tendency to disregard it. We don't accept it, or at the very least, we don't give it much value. We seem to think that our value has to depend on the unanimous consensus of everyone, and anything less than that is meaningless. But if we need the approval of every single human being that we encounter in order to feel worthy, then naturally we're always going to feel unworthy. It's just not a reasonable expectation. Not everyone is going to appreciate you. Not everyone is going to like you, just in the same way that you probably don't like everyone. What we need to do instead is to simply recognize that some people will value us and some people won't, and to learn to be okay with that. If we've somehow gotten into the habit of disregarding people's positive evaluations of us, we could just as well disregard the negative ones, or we can simply learn not to take any of it so personally. And why should everyone appreciate us? Do you appreciate every person that you meet? Do you find value in every interaction that you have with others? Do you find that every person you meet adds value to your life in some way? Do you benefit from every encounter? Do you enjoy the company of every person who you meet? Probably the answer to all of these questions is no. And that doesn't mean that all the people who don't add value to your life are terrible people. Some of them might be, but some of them you might just feel indifferent about. You don't necessarily think less of them. You don't necessarily think that they're unpleasant. You don't necessarily think that they're worthless or that they have no value. It's just that they don't offer anything that you particularly need or want, or they just don't interest you for some reason. The problem sometimes is that we assume that if someone doesn't see the value in us or what we have to offer, or if they're just not interested, it must mean that what we have to offer is worthless or inadequate or defective. But maybe there's nothing wrong with what you're offering. Maybe they just don't need it. Maybe they're just not interested. Or maybe in some cases, they're simply not capable of appreciating it. Suppose that you enjoy feeding people, and so you go out on the street and set up a table to offer free food. There's going to be people who will really appreciate that. There's going to be people who need that because they're poor and they can't afford to buy food. And then there's going to be those who can afford it, but they simply enjoy the type of food that you're offering. And so for that reason, they also appreciate it. But how many people are going to just walk right past? Probably a lot more people are going to walk past without taking any food. Does that mean that it's not valuable? Does that mean that you are not valuable? Maybe those people just don't need it. Maybe they've got plenty of food at home. Or maybe some of them ate just a little while ago. Maybe some of them wouldn't mind a free meal, but they just don't like the type of food that you're offering. It's just not to their taste. We all have different preferences after all. Whatever the case, there's going to be far more people who don't stop than there are those who do. And are you going to be offended every time someone walks by without stopping? Are you going to be offended every time you offer someone a plate and they decline? Are you going to take that personally as an indication of your worth? Because this is very much what we do in life. We offer ourselves to others, and there are people who just aren't interested. There are people who either don't need what we're offering, or they just aren't interested for whatever the reason. And we tend to take it very personally. Or there may be those, going back to our analogy, who do take what we offer, but they just don't show any appreciation for it. Someone takes a plate of food without saying a word. Maybe they don't even acknowledge you at all, and they just walk away with it. Or maybe someone takes a plate and then they stand there and complain about the food. It's not to their liking. Even though it was free and they could just as well have said nothing at all, they feel the compulsion to criticize it. There's always going to be people like that. There are some people who just don't appreciate anything. And there are some people who compulsively complain about everything. And it may have nothing at all to do with you and everything to do with them. If someone doesn't appreciate us, if they don't value us, we tend to interpret that as an indication that we have little or no value. But that's just our interpretation. That's our assumption. That's just a story that we tell ourselves. But that's not necessarily the reality. The reality is just that the person doesn't appreciate us. The person doesn't value us. And that's it. That's the end of it. We don't need to attach any interpretation onto that. It doesn't mean that we're not of value. It doesn't mean that we're deficient or worthless. It only means that the other person doesn't see any value in us or in what we offer. But that's their own perception, and everyone has their own unique perception. And if someone doesn't need what you're offering, or they're simply incapable of appreciating it, maybe don't offer it to them. Offer it to someone else who does need it, or who would appreciate it. You know, sometimes we waste a lot of time and energy trying to get someone to see the value in who we are and what we have to offer. And meanwhile, there are others who would very much appreciate it. But sometimes they never find out because you're too busy trying to please someone who maybe isn't appreciative of anything. Someone who is determined never to be pleased. But coming back to this whole concept of worth, this idea of value, and understanding that this is a very subjective thing, and that everyone is going to value things differently, which means that value is something imposed from the outside. In other words, value is not intrinsic to anything. So perhaps another way to approach all of this is to recognize that nothing has its own inherent value. So that when you feel as if maybe you have no inherent value, maybe that's true, but maybe that's true of everyone. Maybe no one has inherent value. And that doesn't make you less than anyone else. It doesn't make you worth less. It doesn't make you inferior. It means that we're all equal in that regard. None of us have any inherent value, because value is totally subjective. Value is determined differently by each individual. And what that also means is that you get to determine your own value. You don't have to depend on anyone else to determine that for you. And there's a lot of empowerment in that realization. I know that some of you might have been expecting me to sit here and tell you how worthy you are, to validate you with some kind of encouraging words about how amazing you really are. But that's really the whole problem, isn't it? The problem is that we rely too much on other people to tell us our worth. And while some people are going to offer you that kind of validation, the fact of the matter is that a lot of people aren't. And there will always be those who devalue you, or who simply fail to appreciate you. And as long as you require validation from others, well, you're going to find yourself disappointed time and time again. What matters is whether or not you see any value in yourself, in your own gifts and talents, your own qualities and characteristics, your abilities and so on. To see the value in those things independent of anyone else's opinion or approval, as well as regardless of how others behave toward you. You might take some time to reflect on these things, on all the various qualities that you have, and to see if you find value in those qualities. Perhaps you might take a moment to think about the kind of qualities that you appreciate in others, and then to see if perhaps you also have some of those same qualities as well. In fact, it's often the qualities that we admire most in others that are a reflection of our own qualities. It's just that sometimes we aren't expressing them, and so they might go unnoticed. But it isn't as if they aren't there. Maybe we just need to acknowledge them and to embody them more in our daily lives. But I think if you really take stock of your own positive qualities, you'll find that there are a few that we really do embody, but maybe we just don't give them much value for some reason. For instance, you might be someone who is very kind. Maybe you're very caring. Maybe you're attentive to the needs of others. Or maybe you're very honest and sincere. Or perhaps very creative. I don't really know. That's for you to determine. But all I'm suggesting is take a little time to acknowledge your own positive qualities. And again, we might do this by looking to see what qualities we might share with others, particularly with those who we appreciate. And if you appreciate those qualities in others, why would you not also appreciate those same qualities in yourself? And not that you need to be perfect. Certainly, the people who you appreciate aren't perfect. No one is perfect. But you still appreciate them nonetheless because of those qualities that you see in them. So perhaps this is how we begin to reclaim our self-worth, by recognizing our own valuable qualities, by recognizing the value in ourselves, and by determining our own worth independent of what anyone else thinks. That's what it means to reclaim something. It means to take it back into your own hands. It means no longer depending on others to validate you. You need to make that your own responsibility. And when you do that, it also means that when others don't see your value, or when they devalue you, it doesn't matter. They're entitled to whatever perception they have of you. And it doesn't have to affect you, because you already recognize your own worth without the need for anyone else to validate it. And when you reclaim your worth, you also reclaim the power to determine the very quality of your life. You reclaim the power to determine how you feel. You reclaim the power to engage in what you find meaningful. You reclaim the power to live in a way that is much more authentic, much more inspired, and much more fulfilling.